Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha. I am so happy that you joined us today for the Grief and Happiness podcast because I've got a guest that you're just going to love, especially love listening to her because she's got a fantastic voice. And she's also got a fantastic book. It was quite a revelation to me to see our commonalities as I was listening to her book, that I thought, I didn't know anybody else did that, you know? So I thought I was original with that. And I haven't read it other places or seen it other places. So welcome, Shelby.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm happy to have you here. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself to start off with?
Yes, yeah, I'll do the backstory of my losses, but then just who I am. The quick nutshell is that I'm a grief coach and an author, as you said. I'm also a podcaster, which is where the listening to the book comes in. Practicing talking makes it very helpful when it comes to recording the books that I write. And I work with people who are grieving not just the death of a loved one, but any other sort of major life transition. Often people come to me for what I call the 3Ds: death, divorce, and diagnosis. So death that changes your life, a divorce or a breakup, whether or not you were married, and then some sort of diagnosis that shifts permanently the trajectory of your life: chronic illness, terminal diagnosis, or just a new way of seeing yourself, a doorway that you're pushed through, not usually of your own choice, and must grieve not being able to return back through again. I love meeting people in that space of what Brene Brown would call day two, the in-between, the uncertainty, the I don't know what comes next, I don't know who I am now, and guiding them through whatever grief experience they're facing, and there are many of them. My mom died suddenly when I was in college 10 years ago now, a little over 10 years ago now, from breast cancer, and her death was the cherry, I call it, on top of 4 years of unrelenting losses. Before her death, my father had 2 brain aneurysms, one on either side of his head, that almost ended his life. I came out as a queer person in the American South, which was both freeing and scary and confining in a lot of ways. Had a lot of arguments about God and hell and what was going to happen to me when I died and how much that mattered. And then also just a lot of financial instability in my household, a lot of shifts to what I knew to be true as a child versus what I was growing into as an adult. And throughout these 4 years, I was in college. And I was on another podcast, and the host once referred to the time of my mother's death as my launch pad years. I was 21 years old in my senior year when she died. And it was as if all of my peers were assembling these big rocket ships to take off into these marvelous futures and move to these grand places and get these big jobs. And at this crucial point in my life, it's like everything I was building crashed and burned. And that is not an understatement or a dramatization to me. That is really what happened, because in losing my mother, I didn't just lose her. And I think a lot of people relate to this. I lost kind of like my physical sense of home in the world. At 21, my mom was my home in the world. My story of a nuclear family, the 4 of us that would continue on indefinitely into the future. I lost faith in God as I knew it, a God that rewards good people and punishes bad ones. So why would God kill my mother? Sort of was the story I was telling, but it was a lot more deep and complicated than that. And then hope of resolution as well, because my mom died when we were in the middle of a fight about who I was and who I loved and what I wanted for my future and whether or not she'd ever come to my wedding. And there were so many things in her death that I had to grieve in addition to her death that it made it really hard. I think I looked around a lot of times in my family, and whether or not this is a story I told myself or if it's actually true, I think a lot of people around me got to be sad and miss her, whereas my dominant emotion in grief was rage. I was angrier than I was sad. a lot of the time and reckoning with emotions I had never felt and then really didn't have names for a long time after her death really, really changed my life. And what got me moving towards grief instead of trying to fight it or push it away or hide from it or hide it from other people was having my wallet stolen 2 years after my mother's death. I was working in downtown Chicago. I was watching something on my computer and somebody just lifted my wallet and walked out of the restaurant. And having something that was so crucial taken from me emotionally sent me back to a place where my mother, something so crucial, was taken away from me. And so it resurfaced all of this old grief. And for the first time since her death, I let myself wail and scream and cry and pound the floor and essentially throw an adult temper tantrum. And when that stopped about a half hour later, I heard this voice in my head that said, "You just gave yourself permission to grieve." And I was like, oh, what is that? I am so curious about what that means. And what does it mean that I'm only now giving myself permission to grieve? What have I been doing in the meantime, not giving myself permission to grieve? And what does it look like to keep giving myself permission to grieve? And that led me down this whole path of exploration of books and podcasts like this one and learning from people who had grieved before, people who've walked the road before, and slowly coming up with ways to talk about grief in ways that made sense to me and made sense to other people, things I did not have when my mother died. And I started talking about this privately on Facebook, and enough people were like, "This is helpful. You should do something with this." And very slowly that grew into a podcast, which grew into books, which grew into more podcasts, which grew into a coaching business. And now it's how I spend a great deal of my time. And I love existing in this world and thinking about grief and making room for grief in a society and a culture that still doesn't, despite all we've been through, despite all the griefs of our past, but all the griefs of the very recent past. I'm thinking of COVID and just the year 2020 in general. But I love being the person in a friend group or the person in a family that is the grief person. Oh, you want to talk about grief? Go talk to Shelby. And that feels very much like what I was put here to do. If I can put that fine of a point on it, I sure will. Yeah, and I just love it. I never really run out of energy to talk about grief, think about grief, write about grief, and how it changes all of us and how it's so worthy of being given permission and being given a seat metaphorically at the table of our lives and of our memories.
Wow, I'm so glad I asked you to do that. You amaze me. I'm so impressed with you. I love your focus and your smile. When you talk, you can hear your smile and you're talking and with and I mentioned your lovely voice. It just is so comforting that I just think that's wonderful. I know with what I have done with grief and dealing with grief, I started out just with working with grief until I kept thinking there was something more, something that I was leaving out. And that's when I brought happiness into it. And since I've done that, it changed everything for me. And I really love it now. I'm positive all the time. It's not like you can sink into the despair that you can. Sure, you're down sometimes, but I know that I can always turn it around when the time comes for me to turn it around. And I have that feeling from you that I would think working with you would be just great. So you mentioned before we came on air about Grief Cruise, and I'd like you to tell me that story. And also, let's start there. Tell us about that.
I'll tell you the specific story I told you, but the Bereavement Cruise is an organization that takes grieving people literally onto a cruise ship for about a week and a half or so. It was paused during COVID, but has resumed now. And I was invited to speak on the cruise in 2019. And this woman comes up to me, one of the attendees of the conference, and she looks at me and she says, "I hope this isn't insulting." And you never know what somebody's going to say after that. And I was like, okay, here we go. And she said, "After my husband died, I found your grief podcast on YouTube, and I have been listening to it for months and months, not because I actually listen to what you're saying, but because it helps me fall asleep. The sound of your voice, the topics you talk about, even the moments where you're laughing together, where you're with your guests, it has helped me feel safe in the world again, or safe enough to sleep. Sometimes you can't totally feel safe in the world after a loss. There's just safe enough. And knowing, and you and I know this, being in the podcast space, just having a voice to listen to when you're grieving that has been there before or that is there right now is so comforting and so helpful, even if it fixes nothing. And it's every time I sit in front of a microphone, whether it's to be on somebody else's podcast or to record my own, I try to pause and take a second and remember who I was and what I needed after my mother's death and come from a place of that energy. And even right now, this is not related at all to the question you asked me, but the new podcast I record is not one with guests. It's one where people write in with anonymous letters of things that they're facing in their grief and deep, dark questions that they have about loss, or what do I do if I don't recognize myself anymore? What do I do if nobody wants to grieve my person with me? What do I do if guilt is the only thing I feel after their death? And coming from this place of sitting with who that person is when they wrote that letter and thinking about what they needed and where they are, it shifts from this place of I don't need to solve this. I don't need to offer you an exercise. Sometimes I do, but acknowledging that what they're feeling isn't crazy and that they're not alone and that there are paths available to them, even if they can't see them right now. I don't remember who wrote about this. It's some writer I admire, but I can't remember. So if somebody knows, please DM me on Instagram or email me and tell me who wrote this. But I think a role that people who work in grief play is simply to be hope holders, to hold on to hope until we can give it back to people for themselves. And to just sort of like sitting on an egg, like I will
Uh-huh.
sit on this egg of hope for you and with you. And we know that it's here in the room with us. If you can't hold on to it right now, if you don't trust yourself with it, if you don't recognize it, if you've never seen it in your life before, if you don't want it, like F hope is a mood I have a lot of my students and clients in, which like totally valid. I'll just hang on to it for you until you're ready to take it back. And that's such a beautiful and honorary posture to sit in as a person who works with grieving people, to be the one who's comforting you, even if you're not listening to Jack, all of what I say, and to be the person who holds on to hope until you're ready to take it back for yourself.
I love that. I think that's just fabulous. I think that really is what people could use a lot because so many times they're lost. They think they don't have any hope. They don't think they have a future. They don't know what they're going to do next. They've got all these things that they're convincing themselves about that aren't serving them. And if somebody else could hold those so that they could deal with what really is true and what really is happening, wow, what that would do for them. That's just beautiful. I love that.
Yeah. I teach an online course called Life After Loss Academy. It's like the biggest thing I do, or the most popular thing that I do. And in one of the final lessons, we talk about hope coming back because you don't want to grieving people with like, okay, let's talk about hope, like first thing in the morning. It's like, no, you've gone through, I mean, probably 50 different video lessons of, how to feel safe in the world again when loss has taught you anything can happen, how to release difficult emotions like pain, how to integrate loss into your life and remember your people, how to talk to friends and family about grief, especially if they don't support you or they're judging you for grieving. And then finally, at the very end of the course, we talk about the return of hope. And a visual I love to use is hope wearing different clothes.
Mm.
And I often used to describe this visualization of like sitting in my window and looking out at my driveway and expecting hope to walk up the driveway and come back home over and over and over again in my grief. I'm like, when's hope going to come back? Kind of like a dog waiting for its owner to come home from work. And I remember, I can't tell you when it happened after my mother's death, when I started to hope for things again. But what I do know is that when hope came back up the driveway, it did not look the same as when it went away. It was wearing different clothes. It looked like it'd been in a fight. Like hope has seen some stuff because so have I. And so for hope to return or joy to return or insert emotion here or happiness to return, you talk about grief and happiness. Sometimes happiness after a loss will come back wearing different clothes. It will not feel the same. It will not taste the same. It will not live in the same zone in your body as it may have lived in before. It will not maybe shout the same praise or stories or exclamations of joy. It will look and sound different because it will have seen the things that you have seen. And so to open your arms and welcome hope or joy or happiness back into your life again, even while it's wearing different clothes, to not push it away and say, no, give me the shiny one, give me the old one, give me the one I recognize that's familiar, but to embrace the battered version of hope, joy, happiness, wholeness, purpose, whatever it is that you're waiting to return. It's such a lovely visual for welcoming back yet another piece of yourself that has been impacted by grief. Because, like you, every time something wonderful happens, my immediate second thought is, I wish I could tell my mom. Or my best friend died during COVID. I wish I could tell my best friend. And so, kind of the ranking of, I'm racking up dead people I would love to tell things to. I'm laughing about it now, but the scoreboard's getting real high up there.
Yeah.
And hope or joy or delight or achievement or success, they all wear such different clothes now than they did when I was a 20-year-old girl before any of this ever happened. So yeah, thinking of these emotions coming back to you wearing different clothes or looking different, however that helps. Yeah, it's a way to see things differently.
I really like that. I just came to me while you were talking about that one thing that I discovered here in Hawaii after my husband Ron died, because I've had two, so I say their names to delineate who's who. But Ron is the one I came to Maui with, and one of the things that I did, I started getting involved on the island with different things having to do with death that I had never heard of before. Like I hadn't heard of a death cafe. And I ended up not only going, but ultimately leading the death cafes because the person who was doing it was just too busy. And I thought, we can't let this go because it's too valuable. So we'll do that. And the organization that had created that death cafe and a whole lot of other things related to death on the island was co-founded by Ram Dass, and who lived on the island at the time. And he's a brilliant writer, a wonderful human being, just a really, really fabulous person. And fortunately, I did get to be with him before he transitioned, because it wasn't, I think he died 2 years after Ron did. But one of his last books that he wrote was called Walking Each Other Home. And I love that's kind of the work I'm doing now, is we're all walking each other home. And I think that's kind of beautiful.
Yes. And maybe sometimes what we're walking home is these pieces of ourselves that we thought had gone missing. Mm-hmm. So like walking hope home, or walking joy home, or walking happiness back home. Yeah. Sending out a search party for them, or even just going to get them wherever you know that they are.
Yeah.
And walking them home.
It's just so important. And when you can get to the point, one of the things I do is I write to people that I can't talk to face anymore. But when something really comes up that I feel like, oh, I wish I could communicate with them, I think, well, I can. I'll just write. And I did this actually yesterday when I woke up in the morning. I thought, oh my gosh, this would have been my wedding anniversary with Jacques. And it was a big one that I thought, we can't have been apart, for as long as we have been. But of course we have been, because he died a while back. But I still keep the love alive with the writing that I do with my loved ones. And it's not just my husband's. I can't tell you how many people I know that have died. And it sounds like you've had that kind of experience too. And I've also dealt with a lot of death that wasn't necessarily somebody I know, because I started when I was 13. My dad traded our house for an ambulance company. And
Wow.
my mom and dad and I ran it 24/7 because it was a long time ago when they didn't have things like radios in the ambulances. So we would go red lights and siren to the back door of the hospital and bang on the door and hope somebody would hear it and come answer it, and then hope that they could find a doctor who would come in and see the people because they didn't have doctors on staff in the hospital. So it was I learned a lot about death and the fine line between life and death that is a 14-year-old, because at that time you only had to be 14 and have an advanced first aid certificate to go on ambulance calls.
Wow.
And since the three of us were running the company, we didn't always have an employee that could go out. And I went on my 14th birthday, I went on my first ambulance call. So I have been looking at deaths from so many different angles for so long in my life that it's a natural thing to me. And of course, it is a natural thing in general because we all die and we all grieve. And if we can recognize that that's what life is living, being born, living, and dying, that's the three things we all do. And when you can put it in that kind of perspective and be open to it, it can free you up to experience your life experience in a whole different way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Um,
Keeping the end in mind, not as a source of anxiety,
mhm.
sometimes as a source of anxiety, but as a source of what really matters. And I'll tell you what, I've had a lot of different jobs since my mother's death, and even just measuring what feels like a crisis has changed, having had somebody die so young. And part of that, I think other people look at that situation like, oh, that's so sad that you have had that experience. And I'm like, well, no, it's actually very grounding in a way. Like if I bring an order to the table and I forget ketchup and somebody's blowing up at me, how dare I be such a dumb idiot, blah, blah, blah. Forgot the silverware, this, that, and the other. And I just take a deep breath. I'm like, this is not the worst thing to ever happen to me. This is not the hardest thing I've ever been through. I will go get you some ketchup and a fork and I will be right back. And I don't say that out loud. I don't tell people, I don't,
No.
you can't hurt me. But handle it with grace, bring the ketchup, all that. But I mean, talk about a perspective granter that you had in your life as a kid, as a 14-year-old kid in an ambulance, of exposure to life and death at a proximity that I think not a lot of people, including myself, get. And
Mhm.
it really does change how you see the world. I often talk about, and I talk about this in Life After Loss Academy also, of grief is a lot like having a pair of glasses permanently glued to your face. Once you see and know grief, you cannot see and unknow it. You will see everything for the rest of your life through the lens of grief. And that's not always a bad thing. It's not a curse.
Mhm.
But everything from, somebody walking an elderly dog outside in one season, and then suddenly you see them 6 months later and the dog's not there. That is seeing through the lens of grief. Seeing death in music and movies and television, that's seeing through the lens of grief. Even I work part-time as a florist now, and watching the life cycle of flowers that we bring in and working with flowers through the season. Just last week, we got our last order of daffodils. We won't see them again until next March.
Mhm.
That there's grief in that, of things having their time and then going away and not having access to them again. It's a way of seeing that if you allow yourself to look through the lens, and can understand, like, this is not a curse, it is a reality. And it's sometimes one you don't want to be living, because there are people walking around without grief glasses on, and they may never know what it's like to wear a pair of grief glasses, and you can't really show them. You can't take off your own glasses and put them on somebody else's face. But when you find and meet other people who are also wearing grief glasses, what a relief that is to say, oh, you see how I see because of things you've been through. And they may not be the same things, but they have similar ties or similar themes. And to be in the Grief Glasses Club. Yeah. Yeah. I tell my students, in the course. I'm like, we're all wearing grief glasses. They're all different colors and they're all different shapes and they're all different styles, but we've all got them on our face. And they change how you see the world and what you appreciate and what matters. And yeah, the perspective that you bring with you every day.
I love that. That's one of the best things about the opportunity to grieve, is to be able to see things from that different angle, that you can appreciate things so much more. And having not been, like, for instance, my dad died very suddenly. He was giving a speech on stage the night before, and the next night he had a heart attack and died, and that was it. And all the things I didn't get to say and didn't get to do, boy, do I say things now. I don't let opportunities pass. That if I want to tell somebody how much I care for them, or how beautiful something they did is, or how much I value their friendship or their relationship, I tell them. In the past, I might think about it and, don't get around to it. But it's changed my whole perspective on life so positively because of that, really valuing what's important now and seeing what I do as opposed to what I avoid or I don't get around to or I beat myself up over. So, and I do that a lot too with writing. When I mentioned about realizing that yesterday was my anniversary, that I wrote Jacques a letter, and there still were things after all these years that I had to tell him that we hadn't talked about. And it's just kind of a wonderful thing to put things down in writing. It makes them seem more real somehow. And of course, I really encourage people to write through their grief. That's how I help people, is with that whole process with that. And that was one thing about your book that really got me, is one of the things that I started doing, well, after Ron died, and we'd only lived on the island for 2 years before he died. And he was sick most of that time. So I was taking him to the hospital or, taking care of things. And I wasn't spending a lot of time going out and getting familiar with the island and meeting people. And when I decided that the writing that I was doing for myself was helping me so much, and I wanted to do that for other people, I thought, I don't know anybody on the island who's dealing with that, except for people that I knew who knew Ron. And I decided I'm just going to put a message on Meetup and see if anybody comes. Say, if you want to learn ways to write about your grief, then come on over to my house. And they did. I didn't know a single one of the people that came over. And we became a really tight group. And at first, I was just going to meet once a month. And they said, oh, we've got to meet more often than that, because they enjoyed it so much. And
I got stuff to say.
Yeah. And they started bringing things with them. Like I always made iced tea for them because we'd do it in the afternoon. And I love different kinds of teas. So I have all different kinds of herbals and different, like butterfly pea flower is blue tea, and people love that. And raspberry tea that's just bright red. And so that got to be kind of a thing to have the tea. Well, they decided they needed to have something to eat with the tea. So yes, some of them would bring vegetables, others would bring cookies or whatever it was. And we just became a family by writing together, and then talking about what we wrote. And so that's what my Grief and Happiness Alliance does now. Once a week, anybody can come and we write and then talk about what we wrote about and learn a happiness practice. And I love that process of writing to deal with it, because if you just think about something, it's that voice in the head that Eckhart Tolle calls it, that just kind of is all over the place. Well, do this or think about that, or, just constantly, and you don't really work through anything, or it doesn't really help. But when you write it down, it's written down, and you don't need to keep saying it. Your story gets shorter and shorter the more you write it, because you get tired of writing it. You don't have to write that much to say the same thing over again. So anyway, with that whole thing, I love using writing as something to help with grief. And one of the things I taught them early on was how to write haikus and
Yes.
how it could help them with grief. And they loved it. I have one person that still today, and this was before the pandemic when they learned how to write haikus. She still writes haikus every morning when she gets up.
Wow.
And they all couldn't wait to share their haikus that they'd come up with during the week. And then when I got to your day that was on haikus, I thought, oh, somebody else gets that.
I love it. I actually pulled that ironically because I'm on this podcast right now from another podcast called Happier with Gretchen Rubin. She wrote the book The Happiness Project, and she spoke about challenging yourself to compress each day of your life into a single haiku, kind of like a bullet journal or a sentence a day journal, but a haiku a day journal. And she's like, challenge yourself to write a haiku for a day of your life or a season of your life and see what happens when you have to compress your whole experience into just 575 words in each line. And it made the cut. It made it into the book. And it's something I love about grief is that, especially for me, full transparency, probably would not have reached for your book right after my mother died because the thought of happiness felt like an insult. Like it felt so far away and so far from possible. But what I could reach for was funny. Like grief couldn't be happy or joyful or peaceful, but even morbid humor, like grief could kind of be funny. And so, like, screw grief, I'm going to write a haiku about it, felt like giving the finger to the man, if the man is grief, in a way that was playful and silly and kind of like grief support, but through the back door. Not like a direct, like, okay, it's time to be happy. It's time to be joyful. It's like, well, what if we just mess with grief a little bit? What if we twist it into rhyme or twist it and make a limerick out of it or write a dumb song about it that you sing in the shower that nobody will ever hear? Like, what, how do you, and this, goes way off on another tangent, but how do you play with grief? As opposed to trying to, happiness and peace and joy. They felt like such big concepts to me. But if I could get curious about grief or play with it, especially through language, because I grew up writing a lot and wrote a lot about my grief after my mom died, also, that felt like a much easier or more accessible doorway, like a less tax on my brain and less pressure to, well, if I wasn't happy by the end of it, then no big deal. It's just a song I made up in the shower. Wasn't high stakes. It wasn't happiness for the rest of my life. It was a song I sang one time to make myself laugh. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I know I had people, one friend in particular, whenever she'd be in a bookstore, she'd look in the grief section after I started writing. And she would pick me up books that were written by comedians or that had experienced their experience of grief through comedy. And when she first brought them home, I thought, this is kind of weird. I've never been a real comedian person. I like humor, but sometimes a lot of comedy doesn't appeal to me because it's either deprecating or just it's not my cup of tea. I'm a more positive person. But I started from that experience of these funny, so supposed to be funny books about grief. I've noticed that it's like everything, all the new movies or all the movies or all the books, they all have grief in them someplace. It's part of the plot in everything. And when you start seeing that, it allows several things. It allows you to see the humor that you wouldn't have before. It allows you to see that everybody is experiencing this, that you're not the only one. Because I know I've had people tell me, oh, I'm the only one that's ever felt like this. Well, no, you're not. We all go through different things in the process. But both the humor and then the people needing to tell their story. When people are wanting to write their book about their story, it generally is motivated in some way through grief.
Yes.
So,
and I think it's a fine, like, what better reason to write?
Yeah.
Than to process, than to remember, than to excavate hope, than to play. That's probably my favorite reason for writing. Yeah, yes, agree.
Yeah. Wow. I think I could talk to you all day. Got a lot of things in common and a lot of interesting things back and forth. But we'll just have to stay in touch.
Yes.
That's one of the things that I've been wanting to do too, is find some way of networking with people that do the kinds of things that we do that are a little bit different, and be able to stay in touch and inspire each other with, oh, I could do that, sort of thing to help each other out and along with walking each other home, I think.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining me today. I love yeah, you've got it covered up. Your grief, your way. Did I say it
Yes.
right? Yay.
That's my book. You're right.
I thought, oh, I hope I remembered this right. I love even the title of the book. I love what it is. It's what we need to think about, that we each are on our own path. And when we recognize that, and we see that we don't have to do something the way somebody else does just because they did it that way, then that gives you a lot of space to be able to deal with things and to be able to move forward in a way that's right for you.
Yeah. I tell people to play book roulette because it's a non-religious daily devotional. So it's got numbered days. So there would be an entry for today if you wanted to look up the entry for the day. But a lot of people tell me they don't read the book in any sort of order, and they just flip open, and whatever the page says, that's what they decide they need for the day. And it's a fun and playful way to engage with grief, however you'd like to do it. And then there are other people who are like, I go religiously through it at day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, because they like the sturdiness and the ritual of having one thing to do or one thing to read every day, and to devote literally, 2-3 minutes to reading about and thinking about grief. So it is really your grief your way. I did not pick the title, but I think it works. I think it fits, and so many people are granted a sort of permission in the title. They're like, yeah, it is mine. I get to do with it as I will. I get to process it how I will. I get to play with it how I will. Yes, and it's a lovely calling card for me too. In a field where my first book was called Permission to Grieve, and now my second book is Your Grief Your Way. So we're really driving home the point that your grief belongs to you. No one can take it from you. No one else can make meaning for you. No one can tell you what it is. That's the part, for as much as gets taken away from you and lost, that's the part you get to keep for yourself.
I love that. That's just so beautiful. And I love the fact that you've got something for every day of the year. And it's
Yes.
kind of like with my book, it's for every week of the year that there's something, but you don't have to read them in that order. I tell them, I like that book roulette.
Yes.
That's such a good idea, because I tell them, just open it up to the table of contents and read the chapter that jumps out at you that day. Or when you're feeling like you need some comfort or something, just find out which one of those ones it is. And between the two books, there's 52 different chapters on 52 different subjects, and it gives you a way to explore things that you might not have even thought about thinking about before.
Exactly. It's the pick a card, any card, and they're all helpful of books.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I know I told you I listened to your book, but I'm going to have to get a copy of it that I can hold in my hand and make notes and write from that. So that's one of the things about books that are recorded, is that if there's something that you want to go back and refer to, it's not as easy as when you're putting Post-it notes on the pages. So. So, well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was just been delightful, and I'm sure that we've inspired a lot of people with this conversation.
I hope so. And thank you so much, Emily, and to everybody who's out there listening. I really appreciate you just being here right now and doing this right now.
And I appreciate the same in you. It's a perfect thing for us to do. And, one of the things I liked about this podcast is both of us were smiling through most of it.
Yes.
I think that's way cool. And of course, all the information about Shelby will be in the show notes. And I really encourage you to pick up a copy of her books. I just have the one, but I'm going to get the other one now too, because I'm so inspired by you. So
Thank you.
thank you for being my guest. And I'm sure we'll be crossing paths in other ways in the future now that we've met each other. So
Yes, I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
okay, and to my audience, thank you so much for listening. Every time you come to join us, you're going to get something different than you've had before, and you never quite know what it is. It's kind of podcast roulette, I guess. So thanks for being here, and next week it's going to be something different. So I'll see you again then. Thank you so much. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.